Welcome to the deep dive. You've gathered the sources on a really significant policy shift happening in Alabama's criminal justice system. And today, we're cutting right to it. We're focusing on the Alabama Board of Pardons and Paroles, the ABPP, and these, well, highly controversial new parole guidelines. They officially started back in July 2025.
That's right. And this is critical because, Alabama already has one of the absolute lowest parole grant rates in the whole country. So these new guidelines, which they didn't exactly come out of nowhere, right? There was a lot of pressure from the legislature. They really changed the game for what rehabilitation looks like according to the state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This isn't just like shuffling papers. It's a fundamental reweighting of how they decide who gets released. So our focus today is unpacking that key change.
Yeah.
The big move to put way more weight on the original crime, what analysts call a static factor.
Static because it can't change.
Right. And at the same time, kind of de-emphasizing what happens in prison, the rehabilitation part, the dynamic factor.
And the immediate reaction, you see it in the sources, is sharp criticism. Advocates are basically saying this isn't moving forward, it's regression, policy driven by fear.
Yeah, we're going to look at how just a few changes on a score sheet really stack the odds differently for thousands of people and maybe, arguably, make Alabama's prison crisis even worse.
Okay, so to really get this change, you need the backstory, the political context. The board was actually supposed to update its guidelines every 3 years. That's the law.
Right.
The last time was 2020. So by the time this happened in 2025, they were years overdue.
And someone noticed, right?
Oh, yeah. Representative Chris England, late in 2024, he publicly pointed out, hey, you guys are 2 years behind schedule.
And the legislature.
They didn't just talk, they acted. They basically tied the board's funding their operating money to getting these new guidelines done. That definitely forced their hand.
Wow, okay. So a financial threat.
Pretty much. And it says a lot, about how things were working before, because even with the old guidelines, the board wasn't really following them.
All right, let's talk about those numbers because they're kind of shocking.
They really are. In 2023, the actual parole grant rate in Alabama, 8%. Just 8.
8%. But what did their own rules say they should be doing?
That's the crazy part. Their existing guidelines that same year recommended granting parole about 80% of the time.
80% recommended, 8% actually granted. I mean,
it makes you wonder why it even have guidelines, right? If you ignore them 90% of the time.
Exactly. What's that called, the conformance rate?
Yeah, the conformance rate, how often their decisions actually match the score from their own guidelines. It was as low as 5% in July 2023. Just 5.
Unbelievable. Did it get any better?
Well, it crept up a bit, maybe 20% grant rate in 2024. But even then, the guidelines were still suggesting parole for like 75 to 90% of people eligible. Still a massive gap.
So what was driving this huge disconnect? Why ignore their own system?
A lot of it seems to trace back to a specific tragic event. The 2018 triple murder committed by Jimmy O'Neill Spencer, who had been paroled.
Oh.
That incident just unleashed intense ongoing pressure. And the board's focus seemed to shift completely. It wasn't primarily about assessing risk or rehabilitation anymore.
It became about
avoiding bad headlines, mitigating political fallout. We even have former board members confirming that cases got denied mainly because of that overwhelming pressure. Fear, basically.
So these new guidelines, maybe they're just making official what was already happening behind the scenes due to that fear.
That's certainly one way to look at it, yeah.
Okay, let's get into the mechanics then. The score sheet itself. This is core to understanding the change.
Right, it's a point system, but it works kind of backwards from what you might expect.
How so?
A higher score is actually worse for the inmate. It means a lower chance of getting parole recommended. Points add up based on risk factors, some static, some dynamic.
And they changed the passing grade, so to speak.
Dramatically. Under the old system, if you scored 7 points or less, that generally meant a recommendation for parole. Over 8 was typically a denial.
Okay, 7 or less was the target. And now?
Now, much tougher. They've moved that line way down. Only a score of 5 or less gets that positive recommendation.
5 or less. Wow. What about the middle ground?
Scores from 6 to 8 are now this sort of neutral zone. Could go either way, grant or deny, total board discretion. And anything over 9, that's grounds for denial.
Okay, so getting that positive recommendation is significantly harder. And you mentioned the emphasis shifted to static factors.
Yeah.
Let's unpack that. Why is hitting the original offense harder such a big deal?
Well, because it's static, right? It's something that happened maybe decades ago, and it can't be changed.
Right.
So critics argue that if you overweight that, you're essentially saying that Years, maybe decades of positive change, rehabilitation, good behavior, they don't matter as much, or at least not enough to overcome the past.
And how much did they increase the weight on that original offense?
Significantly. Before, the maximum score you could get just for the severity of your offense was 2 points. That was the high category.
Yeah, max 2 points.
Now they've added a whole new level, very high, and that score is 4 points.
4 points. Double the previous max.
Exactly. Right off the bat, potentially 4 points just for the crime itself.
And remember, you need a 5 or less to get recommended. So 4 points puts you right on the edge immediately.
Pretty much, yeah.
What kind of offenses fall into that very high 4-point category now?
The sources specify sex offenses and also felony crimes that involved injury. And crucially, any case that has a victim must be scored as either high, which is now 3 points, or very high, the 4 points.
So if there was a victim involved, you're starting with at least 3 points, potentially 4, no matter what you've done since.
That seems to be the implication, yes. It guarantees a large group starts very close to that denial threshold, regardless of rehabilitation efforts.
Okay, so past actions way heavier. What about current behavior? Inside prison, the dynamic factors. Any changes there?
There were some adjustments. For instance, if you get a disciplinary offense, specifically one involving violence, within the last 12 months, that now scores 3 points. It used to be 2.
Okay, slightly higher penalty for recent violence?
Right. But on the plus side, they did add a couple of positive factors, things that can potentially help your score. This came after public comments.
Like what?
Things like completing education, getting your GED, higher ed, or finishing a trade school program in prison. That can now count positively.
Makes sense.
And they also added consideration for being a juvenile offender at the time the crime was committed. Small steps, maybe, towards acknowledging change.
Okay. And there was one other change, more about process, right? About inmates having their say, because they can't attend hearings in Alabama.
That's a really important point, yeah. Right now, inmates don't attend their parole hearings, and usually only those who have lawyers who know the system well manage to submit video statements.
So it's unequal access.
Exactly. But the Bureau is apparently developing a standardized way for all inmates to submit a pre-recorded video statement. The idea is to level the playing field, give everyone a standard chance to speak directly to the board through video, even if they can't be there in person.
That definitely sounds like a step towards fairness, giving everyone a voice.
It could be, yeah.
But despite that potential positive, the overall reaction from advocates, as you said, is really negative. They see the whole new rulebook as deeply flawed. Let's get into those main criticisms.
Yeah. The central argument from critics is that these guidelines end up punishing people for things they can't control, like the original crime severity, or even for, like, shortcomings of the state itself. And they argue it sidelines the whole idea of rehabilitation.
Attorney Lauren Farino was pretty blunt, calling it regression and fear-driven policy. She made that point. If endless incarceration worked, we'd be the safest state in America, which Alabama isn't.
Right. Her point, and others echo this, is that focusing so heavily on the original crime, especially violent crimes from long ago, ignores a lot of research.
What research is that?
Research suggesting that people convicted of violent offenses who serve really long sentences often have the lowest risk of reoffending, partly because they've aged out of crime.
Ah, the aging out factor.
Exactly. Alabama Appleseed, a justice reform group, mentioned they've represented dozens of people paroled after violent crime convictions, and they tracked 0 reoffenses among them.
0.
Yet these new rules make it incredibly hard for precisely those kinds of individuals to even get a positive recommendation because they start with so many points.
Okay, that's the critique on weighting the past. What about the institutional behavior part? You mentioned a paradox there.
Yeah, this one is really something. Carla Crowder from Alabama Appleseed pointed this out. The guidelines only look at disciplinary issues in the last 12 months.
Only the last year.
Just the last year. So think about what that means. It kind of disincentivizes long-term good behavior, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, say you've had a perfect record for 10, 15 years, spotless. Then in month 11 before your hearing, you get a minor write-up. Maybe for something nonviolent, like the classic example they use is having an extra ramen packet in your cell.
Okay.
Boom. You get penalized points. That decade of good behavior doesn't erase the recent minor infraction in the scoring.
Wait, but what about the flip side?
That's the paradox Crowder highlighted. Imagine someone with a really serious violent history. Maybe they commit another assault inside. But then they spend the next 12 months in segregation, maybe disciplinary-free because they're isolated.
Right.
Under these rules, because all that past violence is outside the 12-month window, they could score 0 points for institutional behavior.
Well, the person with the ramen packet gets points against them.
Exactly. It seems disconnected from assessing genuine long-term change or actual risk, you know?
Yeah, that seems really counterintuitive.
Yep.
Okay, what else are critics pointing to? The reentry plan.
Yes. This is another one where critics say the system punishes people for things outside their control.
How does that work?
So applicants get penalized. They get 1 or 2 points added to their score if their reentry plan isn't complete. And a complete plan needs to show both a confirmed place to live and a confirmed job or source of support.
Okay, that sounds reasonable on the surface. Have a plan.
But critics say, hold on, how realistic is it for someone still incarcerated to lock down a guaranteed job and housing, especially without easy access to, like, the internet, phones, ways to interview?
Good point. It's incredibly difficult.
Extremely difficult. So they argue you're basically penalizing people automatically for not being able to do something the state makes almost impossible to do from behind bars.
So punishing them for systemic failures, essentially.
That's exactly the criticism. Even the Alabama Reentry Commission noted that this penalizes applicants for shortcomings in state agencies because the support isn't really there to help them build that plan before release.
Wow. Okay, one more major criticism area. The stakeholder and community input factor. How does that play in?
This one is tricky. The guidelines say applicants can be penalized if people from the public speak out against their parole.
Even if the actual victim of the crime supports release or maybe isn't involved anymore?
That's the concern, yes. It seems to give a lot of weight to opposition, regardless of the source or its connection to the specific case now.
And are there groups that regularly oppose parole?
Definitely. The sources mention the Alabama Attorney General's office often sends representatives to oppose parole, and groups like Vocational Victims of Crime and Leniency also regularly show up to object.
And their objections are based on?
Critics say often it's just based on the original crime details, the static factors, again, maybe without even talking to the applicant or considering their rehabilitation.
There was that example case, Thomas.
Right, Thomas. A man who'd served over 30 years, and get this, he had 19 letters of recommendation from correctional officers, people who worked with him daily, vouching for his change.
19 KOs. That's highly unusual and speaks volumes.
It really does. But he was denied parole, and the reason cited, negative input from stakeholders. Apparently, the AG's office protested. The victim's family didn't even attend the hearing.
So 19 staff endorsements versus an external objection based on the record. And the objection won.
Seems that way. It shows how powerful that opposition factor can be, potentially overriding significant evidence of rehabilitation.
Okay, so putting all this together, what's the bigger picture? Why does this specific policy shift in Alabama matter so much?
Well, it connects directly to Alabama's ongoing prison crisis. Their prisons have been declared unconstitutional by the federal government because of severe overcrowding and, frankly, horrific levels of violence.
And denying parole plays into that.
Absolutely. If you're denying parole to people who are, by objective measures, low risk and ready for release, you're just keeping the prisons dangerously overcrowded. It adds pressure back into a system that's already failing.
And we have to keep coming back to that fundamental point. Even with these new, stricter guidelines, they're still just guidelines, right?
Exactly. They are voluntary aids. The board has complete discretion. Even if someone miraculously scores a perfect 0 under these tough new rules, the board can still just say no.
And they do.
They do. That case of Terry Townsend is a stark reminder. Completed tons of programs, got a welding degree, had great letters from staff, sober for years.
And denied.
Denied. The board cited the seriousness of his original crime from decades ago, saying release would depreciate seriousness of offense. His brother said he was just overwhelmed with sadness. It shows the score isn't the final word.
So the new score sheet might just be political cover, allowing them to deny people but point to a rule.
That's the cynical view, perhaps, but it highlights that the board's willingness to exercise that ultimate discretion remains the key issue.
Is there any accountability built in? Any follow-up?
There is one mechanism mentioned. A review committee has been set up.
Okay.
Their job is to analyze the parole data, look at how the decisions relate to these revised guidelines, and they're supposed to meet every 3 months to see if the guidelines are actually effective.
Every 3 months. That's fairly frequent.
It is. That review process is really the main avenue for potential adjustment or accountability moving forward.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize this for you, the listener. We've seen the rules definitely got tougher, significantly more weight on the original crime, less focus on long-term behavior, just that narrow 12-month window.
Right? Really penalizing static factors.
But we also saw that one potential positive step,
Oh.
a commitment, at least on paper, to give all inmates a standard way to submit their own story via video.
Yeah, that's a procedural change worth watching.
But the core tension remains, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The new score sheet makes it harder to even get a recommendation on paper. But the fundamental issue, the one that's plagued Alabama's system for years, is the board's track record of just ignoring its own guidelines whenever it wants.
They wrote a tougher script this time, but will they stick to it? Or just use it when it suits them?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
So here's something to think about. Alabama law says these guidelines have to be reviewed every 3 years anyway, but now we have this committee meeting every 3 months. Given all the criticism we've heard that the system is still flawed, slanted, and untethered from results, what will that committee find? Will they find that the only real change was that the board's conformance rate went up, simply because the tougher rules now match the denials they wanted to give anyway?
Meaning they can say they're following the rules now.
Right. Without actually improving public safety or doing anything meaningful about the horrific prison overcrowding crisis. What data, what results will you be looking for over the next year to see what's really happening?
That ongoing review will be key. We'll definitely keep an eye on it.
We certainly will. And we look forward to digging into that future data with you next time.